Good evening again. This is Joe Average Boomer, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the most notable elections in history. In another presentation that I did, I talked about why should we vote and give a good overview of the Electoral College. But there were a few elections in there that are very notable and worth talking about because they're all a little bit different, a little bit weird, and I simply didn't have time to talk to them. So I'm going to address those right now. The Electoral College, this is all the same, but one key element in this Electoral College is that in the original form, in the original Constitution, each elector that went to Washington from each state, all of the delegates that went, each of them cast two votes for the president. Votes had equal weight, they were both for the president. And then the Constitution called for the person with the most votes would be the president, and the person with the second most votes would be vice president. Well, that seemed really good on paper, but it really didn't work out that well because that meant that you could potentially have a three-way tie for president, for one thing. And another thing, it really didn't anticipate the idea of a two-party system or different ideologies. George Washington must have been a great mediator because he won the first two elections unanimously, but then in the third election, which was in 1796, there were the hints of some different ideologies that surfaced. And then in the election of 1800, you had Jefferson and Burr, who were both from the Democratic Republican Party. Both of those words were in the same party name for some reason. The Democratic Republican Party, which actually was the more progressive, and then the Federalist Party, which wanted a larger federal government, and that was the way that the parties were there at the time. So both of these guys, the idea is Jefferson was supposed to be the president, and Burr was his hand-picked vice president. So they had to get Burr enough votes to get Jefferson, so one of the delegates was supposed to vote, for Jefferson, but not vote for Burr, so that Jefferson would have one more vote, and he would be president, and Burr would be vice president. Well, they both got 73 votes, and so that was a tie, and that kicked it to the House of Representatives. So when it got to the House of Representatives, Adams, who was a Federalist, well, actually Hamilton, who was also a Federalist, opposing point of view, but Hamilton did not like either one of these guys, but he knew he had to pick one, so he's going to pick the better of two evils, the lesser of two evils, if you will. And Hamilton threw his support behind Jefferson and so the House of Representatives elected Jefferson president in that time. After that election is when the 12th Amendment was written, and that changed the way the delegates cast their votes. The new way the delegates would all have one vote for president, and they would cast that vote, and then they would have one vote for vice president and cast that vote. And that eliminated this kind of unforeseen circumstance around the way it had originally been designed. But after that 12th Amendment, the method of voting has not changed whatsoever. The electoral is defined by the Constitution, and the 12th Amendment has not had any reason to be changed ever since then. It stood the test of time. Now let's talk about some other interesting elections. In 1824, these guys were all from the same party. There's really only one party at that point in time. So they were all from the same party. Jackson won the popular vote, but he did not have enough electoral votes to exceed half. He didn't get over the half of the vote threshold. So again, for the second and last time in history, the election went to the House of Representatives. Well, the 12th Amendment had modified what the House of Representatives did. It said they could only consider three candidates, the top three vote getters, which makes sense. So that means that Jackson, Adams, and Crawford were in there. Clay was dropped out. So Clay wasn't even considered, even though he had electoral votes. And when it got into the House, Clay swung his support behind Adams, and so Adams won the tiebreaker in the House of Representatives. Those are the only two times they've been to a tie, and I think what happened is politicians after that figured out, hey man, we can't risk this going to the House of Representatives again. We got to have two parties, or two or three parties, or somehow we got to gang up with each other. We got to help each other out here and gang up on the other guys. So that was really the beginning of the two-party system. In 1860, another notable election, Lincoln had the most. He won the popular vote, but he still only had 40% of it. Lincoln was a Republican, hated slavery, conservative guy. Douglas was a Democrat in the North, and they were both from Illinois. But this is prior to the Civil War, and the Democrats in the South didn't like Douglas, so they picked Breckinridge, and then Bell was basically a conservative Southerner who formed his own party and really wasn't much of a factor. But Lincoln was able to win, even though he only had 40% of the popular vote, which was more than anybody else because it was so split up. Really big splits between North and South here. But he did manage to get the most electoral votes because he carried Oregon and California that very barely put him over the edge. And he was elected president. And 21 days after that, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and that really marked. That was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the Civil War is concerned, and that's what started. Go on to fast forward to 1876, Tilden versus Hayes. Tilden had won the popular vote, but he was one vote short of meeting the halfway threshold. One vote short of having enough electoral votes to be voted in automatically. What happened, there was also 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where the votes were too close to call. The popular votes were too close to call, and those states could not figure out who their state really voted for. Very controversial. It didn't require to go to the House of Representatives because technically it wasn't a tie in the electoral votes. It was just states that couldn't make up their mind. So Congress and the Senate jumped in and created a 15-man nonpartisan committee based up of judges and congressmen and influential politicians that were supposed to figure this out. And it turned out, by an unforeseen circumstance, not to be quite bipartisan by one vote. It was out of balance just a little bit. And that balance steered it toward Hayes, who was the Republican. And also, at that point in time, the radical Republicans were oppressing the South. There were federal troops in the South, and the South was very strong Democratic, which would have supported Tilden. But so part of the decision making was, Hayes, we'll give you all these votes. Like they gave you all the votes from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. They gave to Hayes. This committee did. And that put him over the top and got him elected president. And so part of the deal was, Hayes will do this, because these are all southern states, we'll do this, but you've got to get federal troops out of the South. And he did, and he also said he would only serve one term, and he did. And that was effectively the end of Reconstruction and the South, the North, continuing to oppress the South. Of course, it took a lot longer to play out, but that's the way it is. Next interesting election, 1912, Wilson versus Roosevelt versus Taft. Roosevelt was really trying to get out of politics. He was done. He'd been on his fire. He came back, and his hand-picked successor was Taft. And Taft had drifted to more of a conservative wing than Roosevelt really liked. And so Taft made him mad somehow, and Taft still won the party's nomination. So Roosevelt went out and started his own party with very similar but different beliefs. Roosevelt started his own party and was very successful in building up. He was a third-party candidate. And the Democrat, Wilson, what happened is Roosevelt and Taft, but if they had just stayed with one candidate, they would have had plenty of votes to win. But instead, they split the votes, and that gave Wilson the victory, both in popular vote and in the electoral votes. So that was the first example of a third-party candidate doing what most third-party candidates do. They're actually spoilers. They never get enough momentum to be a viable alternative, and so they wind up being a spoiler, and in this case it was Roosevelt. 1948, Truman versus Dewey versus Thurman. Thurman was really minor Southern player, Dixiecrats instead of a Democrat. The notable thing about this, Truman got the popular vote and the electoral votes, but the pollsters had taken a poll in mid-October, and the pollsters were convinced Truman was out of favor, Dewey was in favor, the Republican Congress, he was a Republican, he was going to win, and the pollsters said he was going to win. They didn't publish it until Election Day, and all the newspapers were pre-printed with Dewey beats Truman, Dewey beats Truman, but when the votes were finally counted, Truman won by a narrow margin. And that was really the funniest example of the pollsters and the press being wrong. So they're not as accurate as they think they are. They are getting better, but you never really know. They're not as good as they think they are. Now, 2000. That's been in my lifetime, and I think that's probably indicative of what we may see more of in the future. Gore won the popular vote. Bush did not. But the reason what happened is Florida. Again, we have a state that can't figure out how to count their votes. Or they counted them and they were so close, it was just within a few hundred votes in the state of Florida, which is a very populous state, only within a few hundred votes. And there was recounts, and there was accusations of poll booth fraud and hanging chads and lawsuits going everywhere and all these kind of things. And it delayed and delayed and delayed and never could reach a decision. And somehow it got to the Supreme Court, and finally after about 4 or 5 weeks, the Supreme Court said, okay, y'all been trying to figure this out long enough. Evidently you can't figure it out, and you're not going to figure it out. You better just go with what you got. And so the state of Florida went to Bush, and that gave him the presidency. It was very controversial at the time, but it was the right thing to do. That you can't drag out the decision on the president forever. So I expect, with the way that campaign money is going and campaign managers are going, I think we will probably see more states like that in the future that have races that are too close to call. Although our polling and counting is getting better. And it's improving because of Gore versus Bush. A couple other ones, 1888, Grover Cleveland versus Harrison. Cleveland was the incumbent. He had been elected in 1884, and he was running for re-election. He won the popular vote, but he did not get the electoral votes. Harrison won and beat him. The next year, in the next election in 1892, Cleveland ran again and was elected again and became the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. 1960 is notable because that was really the first TV election. Kennedy and Nixon were both very young. Kennedy was 43, Nixon was 47. There was 4 televised debates that clearly Kennedy was much more charming and better looking, and the 4 televised debates won Kennedy that election. In 2008, we had the big election. This was Obama was the first African American to get elected. I think one of the other things that's significant about that election is that was the first really effective use of social media. Obama was very good at getting out younger voters, minority voters, through social media, and that was the first really election where we felt like there was a strong impact of social media. So, like I say, Trump and Clinton are probably going to be, we've got 39 days of very good entertainment coming, I think. It'll be interesting to see who wins. If I had to pick one right now, I'd say Clinton's going to win. But you never can tell. It's a very thin margin according to the polls, and within this last time period, about a month before it ends, anything can happen. Be a good American, go vote, get out and vote, and let's pray for the best. Thank you.